Um, so thank you so much all for joining. This is the Rights of Way as Habitat Working Group Solar Vegetation Management for Habitat webinar. So to give a quick overview of our webinar today, so we are going to be discussing the benefits of sustainable vegetation management practices on solar installations. And we are going to be doing that through highlighting planning, management, and evaluation strategies that can be utilized for these types of projects. And then we are going to also be sharing some really cool case studies through our presentations and then giving you all the chance to engage with the subject through answering any of your questions during a Q&A session, as well as facilitate peer learning during our guided discussion. So the guided discussion activity will occur during the last half hour of the webinar, and the first hour will have some featured presentations. Today's hosts are myself, Allison Little with the University of Illinois, Chicago, and then I'm also joined today by my two colleagues, Catherine O'Reilly and Caroline Hernandez, both from University of Illinois, Chicago. Catherine's going to be here working behind the scenes to help support some of the tech stuff, and then Caroline is going to be coming on screen later to help facilitate our Q&A session. Some quick housekeeping items before we get started. So please continue to stay muted and keep your video off throughout the featured presentations. If you're having any technical issues, please send a direct message to Catherine O'Reilly via the chat function, and they'll be able to help you address any of those. And then as questions and comments come to mind during the featured presentations, please submit those into the chat. And we'll take a look at those all at the end after the three featured presentations and then address those during our Q&A session. Just a reminder, if you're submitting those to the chat, if for some reason you don't want your name to be associated with your question, you can send a direct message to myself or Caroline, and we'll make sure that that's addressed. And then finally, we are recording this presentation and we'll share it with everyone afterwards within a follow-up email. So with that, it is my pleasure to introduce today's presenters. Our first presentation will be given by Chris Loback from Invenergy. So Chris is a senior manager on Invenergy's vegetation management team, where he supports all things vegetation on utility-scale solar projects within the Upper Midwest. Prior to Invenergy, he worked as an environmental consultant and supported a range of efforts including ecological restoration, habitat management planning, natural resources permitting, and water resources delineation. In his current role, he leans on these past experiences to drive improvements for vegetation-related outcomes on utility-scale solar. Chris places a special emphasis on finding and understanding the often unseen obstacles to successful vegetation establishment, which are commonly related to unavoidable construction processes. As obstacles are identified, Chris works to find and implement solutions that are cost-efficient, satisfy regulatory commitments, meet customer expectations, and prepare the project for operational success. Then our second presentation is going to be given by Jake Jansky from MNL. So Jake is a senior ecologist at MNL, a private vegetation establishment contractor headquartered in Minnesota, with 24 years of experience designing, monitoring, and managing various types of habitat restoration projects. During the last 10 years, his focus has primarily been on projects within the solar industry, working to develop vegetation management plans and designating site-specific seed mixes to integrate pollinator habitat and targeted sheep grazing on utility-scale projects throughout the Upper Midwest. And then our third presentation is going to be a combination of Dr. Alan Knapp and Danny Weaver. So Alan K. Knapp is a University Distinguished Professor in the Biology Department and the Senior Ecologist for the Graduate Degree Program in Ecology at Colorado State University. Prior to joining the faculty at Colorado State in 2004, Professor Knapp taught at Kansas State University for 15 years. He received his PhD at the University of Wyoming in 1988. Professor Knapp's research interests include grassland ecology, global change biology, and ecosystem ecology. He has authored more than 300 research publications and 2 books. He's an elected fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, the Ecological Society of America, and the American Geophysical Union. Currently, Professor Knapp is the lead investigator in in Colorado on the sustainably co-located agricultural and photovoltaic electricity systems project, which is funded by the USDA. The goal of SCAPES is to provide the scientific knowledge necessary to design sustainable agrivoltaic techniques for diverse agricultural practices. And then finally, Danny. Danny is the director of instruction for Sandbox Solar with a strong emphasis in project and construction management. He has been with Sandbox for 8 years and has been involved in constructing numerous APV projects. Danny has a passion for building unique projects that require specialized construction strategies. So thank you so much for all of our presenters for joining us today. And with that, I am going to hand it over to Chris for our first presentation.
Thanks, Allison. So yeah, thanks everybody. Looking forward to talking to you all. I'm going to be talking about solar vegetation management. I'm going to identify some of the challenges we face and some strategies for overcoming those challenges. First, Allison, do I have control still? There we go. Okay, just trying to get the PowerPoint figured out. Before I get started, just a little bit about Invenergy. We're North America's largest privately held clean energy company. We've developed a lot of projects across multiple technology types, and we also have a really robust solar portfolio. As you can see, 59 projects developed, another 30,000 megawatts in our development pipeline. One thing that I think makes Invenergy really unique is that we actually have a dedicated vegetation management team that focuses on solar. And currently we have 9 staff members with a combined experience of over 104 years. And what this team's allowed us to do is it's allowed us to take a deep dive in understanding what challenges solar presents to vegetation or habitat management and what solutions we can implement to overcome those challenges. And I just want to highlight that this PowerPoint, like my presentation, is really based on my experience on utility scale projects in the upper Midwest. So maybe just keep that in mind. So thinking about solar, what is success? And I think achieving success is satisfying this primary objective I've listed. So this is going to be applicable to just about any solar project where we're trying to establish desirable and uniform perennial vegetation that meets project requirements. So what's desirable might change from site to site, but generally we're talking low growing species that can establish quickly, persist throughout operations, and for which the seed source is going to be readily available. We're working on large tracts of land, 1,000, 2,000 acres. We need a lot of seed. So we need that vegetation to help us meet these requirements that are listed. And the first one, probably the most important, is that we need that uniform coverage of 70% perennial vegetation so we can close out our construction stormwater permits. We need to get these permits, obviously, for the construction phase of our projects, and we need this vegetation established so we can close that permit as soon as we can once construction is over. If these permits stay open as we head into operations, that just creates a real risk and a potential for conflict. Additionally, the resources spent on keeping this permit open are probably better spent going and building the next project. Next up, regulatory agencies or project off-takers, they might also have requirements we may need to meet. Things like using certain species, they might have habitat goals we need to meet, or things around invasive species control. Lastly, that vegetative community that is established, it needs to be able to support the future operations of the site. That's where it needs to be low growing, so it's not shading the panels, vegetation that can persist for the life of that facility, and be able to withstand the rigors of the O&M activities that are going to occur, including likely routine mowing. So for us to be successful in our projects, we need to achieve this primary objective. And then when we're thinking about additional habitat, ecosystem service goals, we have to ensure they align with our ability to achieve this primary objective. If they're not aligned, odds are we won't be successful in achieving either one. So next, what are some of the challenges we face on solar? Well, one thing is there's some real limitations on our project schedule. Of course, it'd be great to go out to a site a year or two ahead of time before construction, start our vegetation or habitat related work. However, there's some real limitations on our ability to do that. One is we have to ensure we have all of the necessary regulatory approvals and permits in place, or we have to ensure that we have successfully completed our contracting effort with our off-takers. Those efforts can take time and they might not be complete until almost right before we're ready to start construction. Also, these sites have to turn on, the power has to flow by a certain date. And that date that the power has to be on, that's going to dictate your construction schedule. And things really need to keep moving forward to meet that deadline. And then once construction starts, there's going to be activities across the entire site. And these activities, these construction activities, they're unavoidable and they're going to impact your vegetation. So you need to understand how it's going to impact your vegetation and how you're going to respond to that. And lastly, once that infrastructure gets installed across the site, the piles go in, panels go up, cables go up. You now have all of these obstructions that you have to work around, kind of making your job a little bit harder. And lastly, this is probably the most important, is getting that effective implementation of vegetation actions. It doesn't matter how good a plan is or the aspirations of a goal. If you don't get effective implementation, you're not going to be successful. So those are some of the challenges. Next, just want to cover at a high level some strategies, and I'll go through each one of these in a little more detail. But first step is making that site-specific project plan. So ensuring you have a plan tailored to the exact site conditions you're working in. Next, when feasible, conducting something like a pre-construction seeding event. That's seeding your entire project area before construction begins. Once construction begins, really focusing on ensuring actions are being done appropriately. And then lastly, as that site enters early operations, you want to focus on finishing your vegetation establishment activities and then maybe take on any additional habitat goals you might have had. So I'll go through each one of these more detail. We'll start with the project planning phase. So when you're making your plan, it's important you not only consider vegetation, but also how soils are going to be managed. If soils are mismanaged on your site, that's the easiest way for things to really go off the rails, and it's so hard to recover from that. So it's critical you ensure you're planning for proper soil management. Additionally, when you're looking at your site layout, you want to try to identify if there's different areas in the project where maybe the vegetation could be managed a little differently. Because remember, within the arrays, there's some real constraints on our vegetation. It's got to be low growing, it's got to be able to persist throughout mowing. It's there to support the production of the power. Maybe there's these open buffer areas, which are gaps between our arrays and permanent fence line, where maybe you have a little more flexibility. You might be able to plant a little bit different vegetation. Things are a little bit taller. And then you can manage that vegetation in a way that's more beneficial for maintaining the habitat that maybe you're creating. So these open buffer areas, these might be a great opportunity to install something like pollinator habitat. Now, when you're looking at your seed mix, that's also another critical step here. At Invenergy, when we're looking at developing our seed mixes for array areas, we like to use a combination of native and naturalized graminoid species. And the naturalized species in our seed mixes, they can play a really important role for achieving our primary objective. For example, when we do a pre-construction seeding event, we're seeding before construction, and then construction is going to last 18 to 24 months. That's usually 1 to 2 growing seasons, typically 2 or more, honestly. So when we do a pre-construction seeding event, we include our permanent seed mix with a nurse crop, an annual species, a cover crop. So that cover crop that first year is stabilizing soils, it's out competing weeds, it's doing its job. Then that second growing season, that cover crop, the annual species tend to drop out. And we need those naturalized species that are able to establish relatively quickly to kind of come in and fill the role that that cover crop was playing. So they help stabilize the soils, outcompete the weeds, hold the fort down while the natives continue to fill in. And what's really important is ensuring you have an appropriate seeding rate. So we're using these naturalized species at a seeding rate that's more aligned with a restoration project as opposed to trying to establish turf grass. So we're getting these species out on our site, but there's still plenty of matrix space to allow those natives to find their place and fill in over time. Next is also thinking if you have habitat goals, ensuring there's proper sequencing of those goals within construction. Sorry. Sorry, y'all. If you're trying to accomplish your habitat goals earlier in the project, like seeding these open buffer areas, odds are they're going to be impacted by construction activities, maybe requiring you to go back and fix some things. It might be better to wait towards the end of construction to take on habitat goals when you don't have that potential for a conflict. So next, got your plan, you move into pre-construction seeding. And for Invenergy, we like to permanently seed our sites prior to construction because we can take advantage of these wide open fields and use agricultural style equipment to get the job done quickly. And as that vegetation establishes, as you head in construction, you're now going to have a stabilized working surface, keeping those soils in place, outcompeting weeds, and preventing your crews from working in a mud pit. And then if things go well, hopefully you'll have significant portions of the project where that perennial vegetation is able to establish throughout construction. And if you can get to the point where you have installed infrastructure into established vegetation, perennial vegetation, you're well on your way to achieving success. Now, I thought might be like this pre-construction seeding might be a great opportunity to include forbs, and in particular native forbs in your seed mix because you get them across the entire site. I'm always kind of hesitant to do that, and I think it requires some careful consideration because you have to consider like, are these forbs going to be able to persist through construction and in operations? If not, you don't want to waste that limited native seed supply in an application where it's not going to be successful. So something to think about. Then, once construction starts, there's going to be construction activities everywhere. Every square foot's going to get touched by equipment, staff, vehicles, materials, whatever it is. So there's going to be construction activity. It's going to impact your vegetation. There's going to be mowing that occurs that needs to support construction. So, for example, once the piles are staged, the contractor needs to mow really low so they can see the piles on the ground. They're going to be mowing shorter than what's probably desirable for the vegetation you're trying to establish. It's going to be heavy equipment. We're building a power plant. It takes a lot of equipment. Heavy equipment's it's going to, drive over your vegetation. It's going to have impacts. Like we said earlier, construction must progress. That power needs to turn on. So that's going to require work occurs when maybe ground conditions are not in a favorable condition for that vegetation. Lastly, there's going to be ground disturbance. There's going to be grading, trenching to install underground cables, whatever it is. It's unavoidable. All of these things are going to happen on your projects. What's important is trying to understand how it's going to impact your vegetation and how you can repair these areas. And then when you go into the repair phase, you're going to be faced with a lot of trade-offs. Like there's no real simple slam dunk choice or approach for repairing and doing remedial seeding. For example, the picture I have here of that wide open bare field, that's post grading. Topsoil has been replaced. It's ready to get seeded. Unfortunately, it's summer. So the question is, do you seed with your permanent seed mix when you're outside of a good seeding window? Or do you install a temporary seed mix now, come back in the fall and put your permanent seed mix? Restoration perspective says the latter choice. Unfortunately, in solar, construction is going to progress and you're going to have increasing amounts of infrastructure installed, creating more obstructions that's going to now require you to work around these obstructions to do your seeding. It's going to be harder to use the right equipment. It's going to be harder to get that seed everywhere you need it at the right rate. And so when you're thinking about working around all these obstructions, that might actually push you towards seeding earlier when you can use the right equipment, right ground conditions, but maybe not the best time of year. Regardless of your choice, you're going to be faced with trade-offs, and you just need to understand what those trade-offs are and be prepared to respond. Then execution. So when we're building these facilities, we're working with construction contractors who are there to build a power plant, and they're not necessarily experts on vegetation or habitat. So our job is to really work with them to ensure they understand the actions that need to be done and so they can get done effectively. And if possible, if we can facilitate a connection with our construction contractor and a qualified vegetation contractor, that goes a long way towards being successful. Regardless of who's doing the work, the first step is to ensure topsoils are being managed appropriately. Wherever trenching or grading occurs, those topsoils are being removed, stockpiled. And once that work's done, topsoil is being put back. If you're trying to establish vegetation, pollinator habitat, whatever it is, you're going to need that topsoil. Once that topsoil is back, ensuring that site preparation activities are done appropriately is also critical Too often I've seen seeding occur over crusted over compacted soils. It's not going to be successful. We need that good seed bed. Then ensuring the right equipment's being used to install that seed at the proper depth so we're getting good seed to soil contact. Lastly, you got that seed in the ground, really recommend some form of stabilization on top of that. We like to use straw mulch, which just helps keep soils in place, facilitates germination establishment. It can be an easy step to skip, but also really increases the chance of failure. So that would cause you to have to go back and redo the work. So regardless, like whoever's doing the work, like these are the steps that need to occur in construction if we're going to have a chance at being successful. Then you look to early operations. Successfully got through construction. You really need to ensure that you're carrying through the final amounts of vegetation establishment actions. And part of that's probably going to ensure you have a robust mowing plan that's just doing that mowing that's needed to facilitate that continued perennial vegetation establishment so you can close your permits. Early operations, great time to go back to those open buffer areas and do maybe any of that habitat plan work you had. You no longer have to worry about construction impacting these areas. Lastly, you can also consider doing overseeding with specialty seed mixes within your arrays, adding some more diversity. But again, it's really challenging to do in this phase because you're working on all those obstructions, cables that can just make it more challenging, increase cost. So additional things to consider. Wrap it all up, solar presents an really exciting opportunity where if we can implement the strategies I kind of laid out, that can ensure we're getting the right vegetation established to support achieving our primary objective, closing our permits, while also finding ways to incorporate habitat in a way that doesn't conflict with our ability to meet those objectives. Thanks, everybody.
All right. Thanks so much, Chris. That was excellent. Um, so now we're going to transition over to our second presentation for Jake. And Jake, you should have slide control whenever you want to start.
All right, looks good. Thanks, Allison. Again, my name's Jake Jansky, ecologist at M&L, and I'm going to be talking to you a little bit about our practical on-the-ground approaches to habitat establishment and management that we've gleaned over the last 10 years working directly in the solar industry. Let's see, oh, there we go. Okay, first of all, company I work for is M&L. We are a private company. We've been in business since about 1998, and we've prioritized our mission in establishing, managing native habitats in a huge variety of settings. We do heavy equipment work and stream banks, heavy construction, seeding, stabilization work. We also do vegetation management in a wide variety of settings and implementing a wide variety of BMPs, herbicides, prescribed grazing, prescribed fire, a lot of different vegetation management techniques. We also produce our own seed and plant material. We have farms across Minnesota that grow a couple hundred different species over thousands of acres. So we really are focused on, primarily native species, but as we integrate into solar, we've expanded to much more, I guess, diverse mixes, kind of touching on what Chris mentioned about having naturalized species integrated into projects as well. So we're trying to kind of find that balance between what is most ecologically appropriate and also what's most appropriate for the sites. And then we have a professional services division, which I oversee. It's a lot of consulting, working, planning, trying to develop strategies with solar developers, owners, EPCs, to really ensure the successful outcomes of their projects. There we go. Again, we're based in Minnesota, which I guess is kind of the epicenter of pollinator-friendly solar. Back in 2016, Minnesota passed a habitat-friendly Solar Act. which really jump-started the whole pollinator scorecard situation across the country and really got Minnesota heavily involved in providing habitat, integrating that into solar projects. So our company found ourselves uniquely positioned to take the experiences we gained from the past 20 years of creating habitat and integrating that into solar projects. So our primary work area is going to be kind of the upper Midwest, where our species, seed mixes, all of that transfers pretty readily across different ecosystems in this region. It's also kind of where we have the strongest network of collaborators and partners in the industry that we can integrate into projects well beyond like our home state. So we've been expanding quite rapidly, keeping up with the solar industry as other states in our region get more heavily involved in solar. So just going to touch very briefly on, kind of the start of our process with seed mix design. Chris did a great job of covering all the important aspects of this. So I just want to kind of reiterate some of his points and considerations. As a seed provider, as a contractor who grows, we have a pretty good understanding of the seed market and also of the behavior of the species in these mixes. So I highly recommend that when it comes to the planning phase of your projects, work with somebody who's directly involved in the seed market. There's a lot of vendors out there who do grow and design seed mixes, both in terms of, what species will help achieve those site goals, permit requirements, as well as which ones are hardy enough to stand up to the operational challenges of a solar site. To Chris's point, you don't want to waste a lot of money on species that aren't going to be able to, hold up to life on a industrial energy plant. So really choosing species that are hardy enough to withstand the environment they're growing in, but also can still create habitat value. And I think one of the most important things is really understanding market availability of the species. Not everything is available in the quantities at the time that a developer may want them to be. So really honing in, understanding what species will be most readily available at the time where you will need it on your site. Like many crops, native species have good years and bad years. Some years, certain species just don't produce a lot of seed. We don't grow things in a really strict growing environment. We grow them in natural settings. So the weather, a lot of growing conditions, all that will play an impact on what's available. So just as you're thinking ahead, important consideration to understand what the pulse of the market's going to be when you need your materials. Oops, sorry. Chris did a really good job about talking about the construction process. And so I'm not going to go into any of that. I am going to shift right kind of into the O&M phase and talk about some of our strategies as they apply to vegetation height management, which is probably one of the biggest challenges on most of our sites. There are two, primary methods to doing this, mowing and grazing. And I'm going to kind of hit the highlights of each of them, especially as they relate to the habitat value of a site and what the impacts are on the vegetation. In terms of mowing, obviously you can get a really prescribed height set. Mowing controls the vegetation very uniformly, gives you a nice clean look, doesn't leave any vegetation straggling. So it is a very effective way to create a very aesthetically pleasing sort of vegetation establishment. Also works well, obviously, for weed control. It can really target weeds, especially the annual weeds that are very challenging during the establishment period. Really can time that out nicely to control those weeds when they're most vulnerable, before they produce seed. You have a lot of control in that. Also, in reducing the height of woody species, trees, shrubs, and vines are obviously a huge impediment to energy production. So it's a good way to really control those. Again, it gives you that immediate aesthetic image of the site. It's very clean, looks very neat and very tidy, which a lot of times people find desirable, but may not always be the best for the habitat. It can be easily selective, again, targeting certain weed patches. Also, like in the photo here, reducing the height of vegetation where it's needed along the panels without impacting vegetation where the height is not as important in open spaces or even between the rows, allowing for ongoing habitat use of those areas while still controlling the height nearby. And it's good for the emergency response in terms of you get complaints from the neighbors, things are unsightly, weeds are threatening to go to seed, you can get out and respond very quickly. But with grazing, you can achieve a lot of the same goals. You can reduce the height of the vegetation and the density very effectively. It's just not as rapid as mowing would be. You can target weeds, certain weeds via timing or creating concentrated grazing areas. Can work. It's just a little more effort. But you can control vegetation in hard to reach areas like under the panels and areas that you can access with a mower. And one of the most important things we're finding is you can also reduce the thatch buildup in these habitat settings, which can definitely become a problem over time. You can see here where the vegetation was mowed. There is a substantial concentration of dead vegetation there. There's some obvious fire risk there. So when you take all the benefits of grazing into account, not just the height reduction, but also the thatch mitigation and accessing those hard to reach areas, it can be very cost effective. It's maybe not always the cheapest when you're just strictly comparing it to a mowing event, but when you look at the long-term impacts, there is more to it. Grazing also does provide other opportunities. We utilize a lot of local collaborators around the country, local producers who live close to the sites who want to get into this market. We find a lot of opportunity in helping them establish themselves as a solar grazer by providing access to sites that we are working with the owner on managing. It can be a very effective thing. Not every sheep grazer is necessarily the right partner in this. So we do have to vet them and make sure they're aligned with our habitat goals. But it is a good opportunity for a lot of startup farmers across the country. Also, overwintering sites in warmer climates. We are always looking for places to take sheep, especially from up here in the cold region. And we're also looking a lot at cattle and other livestock operations. And really quick, our grazing approach, I just want to show you this. There is a lot of control we do have over the intensity of the graze event, from very intensive grazing that eliminates all vegetation and thatch, to lighter grazes that have less of an impact on the vegetation, but still reduces the height. Just a couple examples of that. This is a very light graze event, targeting, some height reduction while also leaving the flowering species for the pollinator habitat. You wouldn't want to do this every year. You start to favor certain species when you do things like this, but on occasion in a rotational scenario, it is a good compromise between vegetation height reduction and retaining pollinator habitat. A little more extreme example is the full-on, very aggressive graze event. This was about a 5-year-old prairie planting that had a very thick thatch layer that we were able to eliminate with a very intensive graze. While it did temporarily reduce the habitat value of the area, within about a month and a half, it rebounded and the vegetation flourished, but you now have the vegetation, the reduction of the thatch. So that's a process we'd implement every few years. Again, here's some hard to reach areas that grazers are very effective at hitting. Grazing does not totally eliminate the need for herbicide applications. There are some noxious weeds that will not be effectively controlled. Trees and shrubs, as you can see here, even when veg was reduced, the The trees necessarily aren't killed. They may be defoliated a little bit. So there's still some areas where we'll need to integrate herbicides and bare ground applications around sensitive equipment, roadways, things like that. So it's not a be all end all, but it is a very effective tool for accomplishing most of the goals. We are looking at some of the impacts. Sorry, having a little mouse control. Some of the impacts of the sheep grazing and other vegetation management on our habitat our quality. We just started a 5-year study here in Minnesota comparing mowing, grazing, and a control on 6 different solar sites across the state, all of which were seeded with habitat-friendly mixes. So just wanting to make sure that in accomplishing the operational goals of the site, we're not having a huge detrimental impact to the actual plant community and the habitat. There will be inherently some impacts just based on operations, vegetation management over time, but we want to make sure we're not undoing all the hard work that went into the planning, construction, establishment phases of these projects, and actually, wanting to understand what the impacts on that habitat is over the long-term operational life of these sites. So we're in the process of that, and we're also teaming with Temple University on the same study to review the impacts on the soil profile, carbon sequestration, nutrient recycling, that kind of stuff. Really to kind of understand what the impacts on the habitat are of the work we're doing. And with that, I will say thank you. I think we are right on schedule. So I will pass it off and look forward to questions at the end.
Thanks so much, Jake. That was wonderful. Really appreciate you taking the time to give us all of your knowledge and experience. So next up, we are going to have a presentation from Dr. Alan Knapp and Danny Weaver. So Alan, I'm going to hand it over to you. You should have control of the slides.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Allison, and thanks everyone for joining us today. The presentation I'm going to make today is going to be quite a bit different from the 2 previous ones we've heard. But since my perspective is so much different, I'm not a solar developer. I'm a research ecologist at Colorado State University. I think what we have in common is we're very interested in the vegetation beneath solar arrays as well. So this is going to be a tag team presentation between myself and Danny Weaver, who is involved in this project as well. I'll take most of the time, and Danny will finish us off at the end. So I want to talk to you about a research facility that we built in Colorado. We're in a much drier part of the world than Minnesota. And our research interests here are understanding just how these semi-arid grasslands, or if these semi-arid grasslands and solar arrays can coexist in this part of the world. Just waiting for the slide to advance. There we go. So some background for you all. So we've worked at Jack's Solar Garden trying to understand how that particular solar array affects the grasslands beneath for about 5 years. Some of you probably know about Jack's Solar Garden. It's pretty well known. It's a facility south of Longmont, Colorado. It was established in a way that really minimized damage to or disturbance to the vegetation that was there. The site was primarily a hayfield with mostly a Bromus inermis, a C3 grass that dominated. It's really productive for Colorado's purposes. It's a really productive site. And compared to the site I'm going to spend most of my time talking about, it has very little water stress. So we've been trying to understand how this brome grassland underneath, this perennial grassland underneath this solar array, how sustainable it is, and ecologically just how productive it can be over the years. So again, we've spent about 5 years studying this system. And the high-level takeaways is Jack's Solar Garden takes about 35% of the sunlight away from the grassland beneath. And overall, what we've learned is this generally in Colorado, in our arid climate, reduces water use, tends to increase soil moisture at the site, with really relatively minor impacts on above-ground plant production, or you might think of this as forage for cattle or sheep. On average, no more than about a 6 to 8% reduction in productivity compared to what you would see outside this solar array. What's more exciting to us, though, is that what happens during dry years. So what we've learned is that Jack's these arrays can essentially serve as a way of mitigating aridity in this part of the world. So in this particular graph here, the dashed line is what the control or outside the array. ANPP is just grass growth forage production. The dashed line is what happens outside the array. The bars are what's inside. And you can see an average in wet years at the site, right? We don't see much of a reduction compared to outside, but in dry years, we actually see an increase in productivity or grass growth. Inside, beneath Jack's solar garden, essentially signaling to us that during dry years or dry parts of the world, these arrays might actually function to benefit the productivity of the grasslands. Sorry, I went the wrong direction. So our interest then is thinking about in Colorado where these large utility scale solar arrays might exist. And many of you, of course, have probably been to Colorado. Everyone goes to the mountains, but about 40% of the state is actually covered in grassland. And we think these native rangelands and grasslands are actually and will be that's likely locations of the utility scale solar in the state. And we think these are actually attractive for a number of reasons. They're extensive, as I just mentioned. These ecosystems are front range adjacent to where all the power is needed. The vegetation is by nature very short statured. These grasses grow, there's not much rainfall in this region, and so they tend to be fairly short. The terrain is relatively flat. The land value is low, at least relative to irrigated cropland. And this part of the world has a long history of coexistence already with the energy sector, whether it's fossil fuels and fracking, or whether it's wind energy, as you can see in the background of this particular picture. And so specifically what we're interested in is will the lessons that we've learned at Jack's, working 5 years in this non-native grassland, will they translate to our native grasslands? And again, we want to know, are these two sustainably able to coexist? Can we have these native grasslands coexist with solar arrays in this part of the world? And then eventually we'd like to get to the point of thinking about grazing under these systems as well, cattle grazing in particular, because that's the dominant type of grazing that occurs in this region. And so to do this, we built a very small array, a research array. We call it the Short Grass Ecovoltaics Research Facility, or SURF for short. It's in the northeast part of the state, north of Nunn, Colorado. Again, there's two small arrays, 100 kilowatts total. It's only been in place for a year. We just had it built this last spring. The key is it's over native rangeland. The dominant grasses are warm season C4 blue grama species. And compared to Jack's, it has really low productivity and it's much more water stressed as a grassland. The reason we chose this particular location, in addition to it being native rangelands, is it's also on the site of the U.S. Department of Agriculture's long-term research site for grazing studies, the Central Plains Experimental Range. So we have a lot of background data from this grassland for how it responds to all sorts of environmental challenges, and we can then place our results in the context of their long-term results. So SURF is too small for cattle, but it does have these replicated arrays in adjacent control areas. And our primary goal is research, again, trying to understand whether this grassland can sustainably coexist with these panels overhead. So you just see some photos here of both students in the field and sensors in the field for us trying to quantify water and carbon and species composition and all the sorts of things ecologists might measure in these grasslands. And our initial results are quite consistent with Jack's, and in fact, they even emphasize the aridity mitigation potential overall. So in the upper picture there, you can see what we call the oasis effect this first year that we saw. You can see the grassland in the distance is browned in midsummer, but it's still quite green in and around the solar array. And you can see just some close-ups of the grassland either within the array or outside the array at mid-season. And so we decided to quantify this first year, this effect on productivity on above ground grass growth. You can see the students. Again, we don't have room for cattle. We do have room for students. So you can see the students coming out and collecting samples, essentially quantifying how much grass growth is occurring underneath this solar array and comparing it to outside. That just gives you a shot of their handiwork after they're done. And we don't just sample randomly within the array. We actually sample based upon the microsites that all these solar arrays create. So we have between environment, we have the edge environments. We've learned that both the east edge and the west edge of the panels differ in terms of their impact on the grasses beneath. Then, of course, we sample underneath as well. And this graph is just a simple graph that shows you the effect of the solar array on those different microsites within this facility. And so the dashed line, again, is for the control area. And then you can see the grays between then you step up to under and the two edges, and then what we call these hot spots. These places where there's potential a convergence of gaps between the panels where you get a lot of water runoff during rainfall events and just the right amount of shade that really tends to increase productivity. But the bottom line is we tend to see increases in productivity within this array versus outside. And so overall, we can say, just like at Jack's, that the improved water availability in our system actually offsets that lack of light. The results were also harvesting about 35% of the light here as well, but the water savings are clearly much more important for productivity. As I mentioned, we work at a long-term research site, and so we can actually put our results in the context of the long-term data. So this is just a plot of how production, total ANPP, this is just grass growth for the cattle again, how it varies across the site over the years in 3 different locations. Our site's most similar to the ridge. And you can very quickly see, the slide will advance. There we go. There's the number for outside the array this first year. There's between, there's under the edges of the panel, and here is where those hot spots are. And so what we see overall is this generally large increase in productivity, as well as this tremendous variability in productivity under this array, equivalent to what we see over 40 years of wet and dry years combined, we see within a single year within this array. We think these hot spots might be really, really important for cattle grazing during dry years, and overall we do see quite an increase in productivity. All right, so what we want to go from here, we want to ask if cattle can coexist with these arrays as well. So that's where we're going next. There's a lot of concern in Colorado about cattle being able to coexist with solar panels. There's a lot of strong opinions. This is my favorite one, just from a video I found online. I think there's a lot of speculation without much data. So our eventual goal is to really see if we can demonstrate that grasslands, the cattle that graze them, and solar arrays can all coexist together. Okay, so I'm going to hand it off to Danny real quick. He's going to talk a bit about how he put this array, how he built this array for us. Because remember, our goal was to actually have native intact grassland to minimize disturbance overall so that we could study how this system responds. And I must say that Sandbox Solar did a great job of doing that. So Danny, I'll turn it over to you.
Alan. Hey everyone, I'm Danny. I'm with Sandbox Solar. We're based out of Fort Collins, Colorado, so we share a hometown with Colorado State University, and we actually do quite a few projects with CSU. The photo on the right is another APV project we did with CSU at their RDEC South site. So I guess I will dive in here. As Alan mentioned earlier, minimizing ground disturbance was the major priority for the research they were conducting, which started us off thinking, how do we go about this? Generally, when we're doing these construction projects, it's not necessarily a consideration to worry about ground disturbance because at the end of the project is when we focus on that. We had to focus on that on the front end for this one. The machine we used, as you can see in the photo on the left, which this is from that project, is our Kubota SVL 75 and Rhino Solar Pro pile driver attachment. This combined machine comes in at 13,000 pounds, which is actually quite a bit lighter than a lot of the other machine options out there for pile driving. Prior to construction, naturally we're looking for safety hazards, but this time we were looking for environmental hazards as well, which of course was to protect that portion of the grassland that was to be studied. The main solution we came up with was to only run the machine outside of the space directly under the array as much as possible to keep that disturbance outside the primary research space. To minimize all other disturbances in general, we needed to keep the tracks of the machine from upsetting that topsoil. And for anyone that's been around heavy machinery, the slightest turn can do a considerable amount of damage to that topsoil. So our focus was to keep using the same track over and over again and take very gradual turns. Definitely took a little bit longer, but we found it to be quite effective. And then the final product came out pretty satisfactory. As you saw in some of the earlier photos, there was already new growth underneath the array before the project was substantially complete.
All right. Thanks so much, Danny and Alan. That was such an interesting case study. Really appreciate you taking the time to go through that. So yeah, with that, we're going to now transition into our audience Q&A session. So thank you to everyone in the audience who's been dropping questions into the chat. We're going to go through those now for about the next 10 minutes. There's a chance we might not be able to get through everything. So if that's the case, we'll try and follow up with some answers to any unanswered questions in our follow-up email. And I'm going to invite all of our presenters to come back and turn it over to Caroline to facilitate the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you, Allison. And yeah, really want to echo what Allison said. Fantastic presentations. They were really interesting. I have a bunch of questions, but the audience has a bunch of questions. And so I'm going to try and get through as many as possible. And then, yeah, we'll follow up with any that we miss. So I'm going to start with Chris. Are you seeing that pre-construction seeding is successful in the arid West? And how are you using the roll and crush methods to preserve root crowns for regrowth during construction?
So that's why in my talk I said this is really focused on my experience in the upper Midwest. I don't really work out in the arid West. I don't really know it as well, but I do know like top priority is preserve the vegetation that's already there. As opposed, I mean, we'll still do some seeding if that's needed, things like that, but way more of an emphasis on preserving existing vegetation versus the upper Midwest. We're working on ag fields where we get them when they're bare soil, so we do have to do that pre-seed. So a little bit different out west, but I think it can be a tool. Top priority though is preserve what's there.
Great, thank you. Jake, does M&L source local ecotype seed when selecting seed for their solar projects across the various regions where you work?
Generally, we do not, and that's only based on the either permit requirement or the owner's preference. We're certainly willing and able to do so. I mean, we do so for a lot of our other habitat projects that are a little more on the, preserve type, lands. So we definitely have the ability to do that. It will limit species available for the project if we do that. But it is definitely common practice, and if the owner wants that, we certainly can do that.
Okay, Dr. Knapp, you showed ANPP, but do you have any data for nutritional quality of the plants under and between arrays, including both intra and interspecific values?
Yes, we do at JAX, not in the native grasslands we work now, but there's a paper whose lead author is Matt Sturcio, and he's actually quantified forage quality of both without grazing as well as with simulated grazing, as in clipping with scissors, to look at regrowth and forage quality and the regrowth as well. So we do have some evidence. The short answer is it does not decrease forage quality at all, and the regrowth actually has the expected higher forage quality, as you might expect. That's typical of any graze system. We haven't done it yet in our native grasslands, but that is on our list.
It's really exciting. Chris, do you decompact your soil? And if so, how and when during the project's cycle? And do you ever use different types of mulch depending on the climate?
Yeah, so decompaction, it occurs like it's an intensive activity, so we try to keep those activities only focused where it's needed, and that's usually going to be high traffic areas, lay down areas. So we'll find those types of locations where we have heavily compacted soils, and we'll focus decompaction there. Most of the site, it's not necessarily a concern. And then, what was the second question again?
I've lost it. Hold on. Sorry. I think it was about mulch.
Oh, right. So do we do straw mulch is like our main tool. We use that quite a bit, or we want to use that in most locations. We do offer flexibility up though for our contractors to maybe find something that's more appropriate. But straw mulch honestly tends to be the main tool we're using.
Thank you. I actually think that this is a good question for everybody, but so are you able to, and I'm going to start with Jake, are you able to grow more sensitive plants underneath the solar panels, or does the entire area have too much ongoing disturbance from operators?
Yeah, I would say it's probably not the ideal situation for more sensitive plants, as it were. In a fixed panel system, It's obviously very shady under there, so it would be a very different whole plant community. Theoretically, you could, but I have a feeling with all the just operational use and stuff, it's probably not the best location for it. And with a lot of the trackers, and depending on their height, the area under, does get almost equal sunlight to the other areas, at least in terms of vegetation establishment. So it's not like vastly different in terms of, especially from native species that, we try to select species that can thrive in a kind of a sunshade environment. So probably not the ideal situation or growing condition for something more sensitive, because I have a feeling there'd still be a lot of impacts on them.
Does anyone else want to add anything?
I can chime in on that. That's a great, I think Jake's answer is perfect from the light point of view. From the water point of view in the arid west, though, we really do create microsites that are quite wetter than the rest of the grassland. So typically on the western edge, these are tracking arrays. So on the western edge, almost all of our rain falls in the afternoon thunderstorms. So it really concentrates the water on that side. So there might be a 20 or 30 centimeter wide strip of very high soil moisture relative to other areas. And it's pretty consistent year after year. And so one could imagine that those types of microhabitats might be able to support species much better than other parts of the array, and certainly much better than might be out in the open grassland as well. So we are interested in this whole heterogeneity question of light and water and how that affects common species as well as rare species and species of concern.
Thank you. It's really interesting. Danny, were the skids cleaned before coming on site? There's the concern of having an influx of ants from outside sites, and it looks like your vegetation preservation was really successful. Did you do any reseeding under the array afterwards?
Good question. We did clean it. That's just standard operating procedure. Another thing that we kept a close eye on is heavy machines leak, and we just didn't want to have it leaking oil or grease onto the research area or anywhere for that matter. So kept an eye on both of those. As far as reseeding, didn't do any reseeding. Nope.
Thank you. Okay. Last round, I think, for everybody. So, Chris, I saw that your seed mix mainly consists of grass. Are you ever reseeding with low-growing shrubs? And if so, what has been your success with that operation of the solar fields and vegetation management over time?
Yeah, so my talk highlighted, we do try to use more graminoid species just under the arrays. We haven't reseeded, as far as I know, using shrubs just because that's probably going to present a real risk in operations. So we definitely try to mostly focus on herbaceous species. And then to Jake's point, there's just a lot of constraints on that vegetation and requirements. And so that also kind of really restricts what we can use.
Makes sense. Jake, does grazing select for invasive species?
It certainly can. That's why we really focus on, the duration of the graze event. If you leave a sheep on there long enough, they will eat everything. So we really try to focus, both, take into account what species we're really targeting. And we also try to vary the timing of the graze, especially in habitat sites. We don't graze them the same time every year. We make a really deliberate effort to move that month to month around throughout the growing season, year to year. So we're not finding ourselves favoring certain species by what they find most palatable and eat first. So we do definitely consider all of that and try to replicate natural grazing regimens as much as we can within obviously a lot of constraints, but it's a consideration for sure.
And that kind of also answers one of the questions on the rotational grazing strategies as well, but I can follow up with some more of those details later. Finally, Dr. Knapp and Danny, have you studied the cost difference between the standard solar array height and a height high enough to allow for native prairie grasses or crops?
So I can start. I have not. Our research goals are primarily to see if they can coexist first and foremost. It doesn't really matter in my mind if there's a cost difference, if they don't coexist in the first place, if this isn't even an option. So our first goal is to see just what the potential is for is predominantly taking the predominant land use, which is not only native warm season grasses, but also grazing of those, and be able to integrate that with this sort of new energy transition. And to me, that would be the win-win-win-win, right? So everyone would win in that regard. You wouldn't have so much pushback from communities around, I think, if their cultural lifestyle could be integrated with this energy transition. So that's really where we are at this stage. I'm confident I shouldn't say will. Yeah, I'll say will. It will cost more than likely to do this. The question just becomes in what are the sort of the cost benefit ratio, and what are the policy levers one might use to make those equal. And I don't know if Danny has any additional comments or not.
I agree. I don't have any data specifically on that difference, but I think what it boils down to is really what the goals of the project are, which is, I think, exactly what Alan said. So,
Makes sense. Thank you all. Like we said, we'll follow up with the rest of the questions, and really appreciate everybody's time for that. I'm going to turn it back to Allison. Nobody leave. She's got breakout sessions for you.
Right. Thanks so much, Caroline. And thank you so much again to all of our presenters. It was so wonderful having you join us today. I hope I can speak for everybody. I learned so much from all of your presentations and the Q&A.